Thank you. My name is Kimball Clark, but my wife and kids call me the bee nerd. So, in about 2006, we purchased a home it was a 1940s home, and it had a beautiful, glorious backyard. It had vintage apple trees. It had 3 varieties of grapes. It had a huge walnut tree, and I loved it. And dandelions galore. I had to tame this yard. So my son was 3 years old, and we would explore this blooming paradise together, and he would always take special note of bees. He would say, "Dad, look, a bee! Dad, a bee!" As a father, it was my responsibility to teach my children, my son, about nature. So I thought, let's just go all in and let's get him some bees. But there was a caveat. My son had some allergies. He was allergic to 2 things, and I could only imagine what would his face look like if he came in with a big puffy face because he had been stung by a lot of honeybees. And so it, of course, brought my mind to a news article that I had read or seen on TV that talked about another bee that was less aggressive, that used mud to build its nest opposed to wax, and was potentially stingless. A mason bee. Isn't that beautiful? Now, let's talk a little bit about the stingless part. Let's just get this cleared up. If any of you have been stung, you most likely have been stung by a wasp, not a bee. And if you were stung by a bee, it was likely a honeybee, and you may have seen the stinger in your skin. Now, you're much less likely to be stung by a mason bee. A little known fact, a lot of people are not aware of, is that a male bee does not have a stinger. That's right, females are the only bees that sting. It's part of their way that they lay eggs. So, bees are separated into 2 kinds of classes, solitary and social. So let's imagine that a honeybee would be a social bee. A whole auditorium, no, let's not say an auditorium, let's say a stadium full of women and babies, okay? And then in the parking lot, you've got the males, and they're enjoying, their food and whatnot, and they're stingless, okay? And just a few of them, okay? They're at their tailgate party. That's a hive, okay? Now, a solitary bee is a little different. They are, think of this, introverted females that happen to have 3 studio apartments. They have about 6 eggs or 6 baby cribs, okay, that they lay, and they lay about 18 eggs in their 6-week life flight, life where they're actually flying. So that's the difference between a social bee and a solitary bee. So you understand that. Now, bees, we have 20,000 species of bees in the world. You may not have thought of that. And for whatever reason, we've hyper-focused on honeybees. I probably know why. I'm a huge fan of honey. I had some today. It's very sweet. And that leaves us with 19,999 other species to experiment with, to learn from, and to potentially manage. So what had happened with me is I was very interested in this mason bee, and I wanted to find it. I wanted to capture it. I read articles online. I figured out how to do it. So what I did is I just followed the instructions and drilled a little hole in a log that was about as long as this pencil and the diameter about the same diameter of size. And sure enough, I captured or obtained, didn't necessarily capture, but I obtained my first female mason bee. It looked like a fly. And so I decided to grow that number of bee, and I first started with 1 or 2. The next year I had hundreds, and then the next year I began to approach the thousands. But by that time, my son, he had moved on to chickens. We now call him the chicken tender. And I'm still the bee nerd. But now I'm dealing with another problem, matters of scale. I had thousands of bees. And bees have two very fundamental needs: forage and shelter. Shelter being the foremost. They've got to retreat. And so I spent years building means whereby these bees could retreat in the case of freeze, in the case of night temperatures, in the case of rain, and they could obtain better shelter. And I have papers and papers, mountains of them at home, of hexagonal designs where I'm creating different ways where they can nest. This is my latest advancement or upgrade to make it more appealing to these introverted single women who are trying to nest. And it's beautiful. In fact, we discovered that fluorescent blue draws these solitary bees. And the other problem that we have to handle is that of forage or bloom, nectar, pollen. And so what I discovered is that I didn't have enough bloom or forage in my backyard. I had to use my neighbors' backyards, and then my neighbors' friends' backyards, and then my neighbors' friends' backyards, okay? And because there just wasn't enough forage to go around for the sheer number of solitary bees that I was rearing. And I suddenly found my solitary self becoming more social and making friends with strangers. Now, these strangers were taking care of my six-legged children. And I became a good friend with them. I now know them by name, and we talk regularly. We teach each other about the bees and how to manage them. And I don't just do this with them. I do this with people throughout the whole valley, throughout the state, throughout other states, and even throughout the world. In the state of Utah, the beehive and honeybees are part of our culture. In fact, the beehive is actually woven into our flag, and it represents industry. Now, these strangers who allowed me to put this bee in their backyard, kudos to them, they weren't getting any honey. But why did they care to have it? Well, pollination, of course, and a lot of people don't realize how beneficial pollination truly is. In fact, for the last 100 years, most commercial beekeepers make more of their money from pollination contracts than their beeswax or their honey. That might surprise you. Truth is, bees like flowers, but flowers like bees too. Here's an example of some apple trees that were pollinated by solitary bees in my backyard. You don't typically see apples like this in a big bunch. We have discovered that solitary mason bees are in fact better pollinators of certain crops than honeybees. That's a big deal. Why? Well, here's some examples. Solitary bees can fly in cooler weather. That's important in spring times when we have weather like we had this year. It was pretty dramatic. Honeybees will come out in temperatures that are only a certain warmth. Solitary bees will come out in temperatures 5 to 10 degrees cooler. Also, solitary bees will stay in a certain fixed location, and they won't necessarily travel 5 miles away, like honeybees. That can be an advantage. Also, they stay close. They stay closer to the crops of your emphasis. Like, for example, if you have tree crops, you want the bees up in the trees, and you want them in the bushes, but you may not want them on the ground foraging for weeds, which is oftentimes what honeybees can do. They can get a little distracted. These bees oftentimes do not. So I was not alone in this discovery. There were many others like me who thought, let's use these bees to our advantage for commerce. Let's see if we can do similar to what natural gas is being done with alternative fuels, but with alternative pollinators. And so people from all over the world began to come together around 2007, 2008. And in 2010, I was instrumental in building a nonprofit. And I worked with people from England, from Austria, from South America, and all throughout the state of Utah and other states. And we built this wonderful organization. Each year we meet, and all of us have a fundamental desire to improve our food security in whichever nation we're from. Here's an example of a mason bee pollinating almonds. We discovered that the presence of mason bees among honeybees actually helps the honeybees perform better, to the point of getting almost 2x production of almonds. That's considerable, considering that almonds are the largest exported crop from California. We also discovered that strawberries and cherries resulted in a similar return. Here we have David Lemon. He is now deceased, but he was a crop breeder, a plant breeder in California, and he had beautiful artichokes. If you've ever seen an artichoke in bloom, it's the most gorgeous thing ever. Smell it, put your nose in it, rub your hand over the top of it. It's a wonderful experience. It's a very alien-like plant. And what he had me do is he had me release my solitary bees in his cages to cross-pollinate certain artichokes to get a certain result. And this is what's interesting. I was focusing on this mason bee, and there were still 19,998 other bees to focus on. And I discovered that the mason bee didn't like this. I discovered that 4 other bees didn't like it either. But one other bee, a close cousin to the mason bee, did. And here's a video of the bees swimming, the females swimming in that artichoke bloom. And those other bees on top are males waiting for the females. Now, this is beautiful behavior. This is what you want to see in artichoke pollination. Next, bee. Right here in Bountiful, there was a man by the name of Farrell Winters that I was able to meet. Farrell was a very kind man. He had heard about what I was doing, called me and said, I have mason bees in my backyard. You should come capture them. So I came over and put up one of my bee shelters, and I discovered an entirely new species that I had never seen before. And I had brought it to the entomologists, and they identified it as a potential pollinator of blueberries. Now, could I really be that lucky? Yes. This is the bee that we discovered. Now, it was already a known bee, but they had not necessarily matched it to the blueberry yet. Now, this is what we're getting from this bee. 98% of the pollen that is brought back from the fields is blueberry pollen when this bee is in a monoculture of blueberries. When you release a mason bee, 60% of the pollen is brought back to its nest is blueberry pollen. When you release honeybees, only 6% that's brought back into the hive is blueberry pollen. That's significant. In other words, we have a dead ringer right here of a pollinator. We're still trying to figure out how many we need to release of this species, but compare that to honeybees, where you need maybe 50,000 honeybees per acre. You need a very small fraction of these bees per acre. And we will know more about that number come August. And that's the bee, which I like to call the lucky bee. Why the lucky bee? Well, it emerges every single year on St. Patrick's Day. It's a beautiful green color, and I didn't just toss it out like oftentimes scientists would say when you're trying to capture a mason bee and you get other bycatch, they call it. I didn't toss it out. We decided to deploy it and use it, and sure enough, it's a blueberry pollinator. Here's an example of the bees in action in a blueberry field. It's often said that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And in this case, that was exactly what happened. My grandmother would say, focus on what you have. in an intense desire to teach my child about nature, I focused on just the little things and was able to create a movement of people worldwide to help increase our food supply and also diversify our pollinators. And if you just focus on the little things, and even in the little things in your own backyard, you too just might get lucky. Thank you.